We are here with Callum Laing, who is the founder of Veblen Director Programme and a partner at Unity Group. He has also served as CEO, chair, director of multiple public and private companies. With over 25 years of entrepreneurial experience, Callum has founded and grown companies across various countries and industries, focusing primarily on helping small businesses access capital markets for the past decade. We're in a series of podcasts inspired by a case study of Wilbur Wright from a long time ago, an American entrepreneur who pioneered self-propelled mechanical flight. Wright exemplified Ethic 3 from the entrepreneur's ethic, fail successfully. This is the experimentation orientation of entrepreneurship. Callum has rich experience with experimentation that we will explore today. So, Callum, from Iowa to Singapore, good day. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a pleasure. It's a very polite way of saying I've failed lots.
If you've done much and you haven't failed, you haven't done much.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Well, let's start back in time. That doesn't seem so long ago to me. When I was starting my career, might have been around the same time you were. But tell us the story about the telco recruitment company that you built in the late 1990s. What lessons emerged from that journey? I started my first company in 1996 in the internet space and had some up and down experience with that.
For sure. Yeah, no, it was the glory days, the heydays. It was all very exciting. I was working as a network engineer on building operation centers for UUNet WorldCom.
Yes,
you may remember.
I do.
So we built their European operations center in Amsterdam, and there was a group of like, I don't know, 30 of us, young, overpaid, living in Amsterdam, having great time, doing super interesting work, and building the backbone of the internet, and it was very exciting. And we started getting headhunters approaching us, and I'd sort of the difference I had, I was never a good engineer, but I was often the only one that could communicate with our managers and our clients. So the good engineers would grunt and scowl, but fix the problems. I wasn't very good at fixing the problems, but I could explain what was going on. And it turns out that was a more valuable skill. So I kind of got promoted quite quickly, and started getting these headhunters approaching me. And I couldn't work out why they were going to such lengths, like flying out to Amsterdam, buying me meals, like offering me huge amounts of money. So I kind of got interested in what that model was, and realized that basically if they placed me, and a lot of it was contract work, so sort of daily rates, and we were getting offered obscene amounts of money. But then I realized that they got another 25% on top. So they only had to place me once. If I worked there for 6 months, every day they were getting 25% for doing nothing, in effect. And I thought, well, that's a good game. I know all the main telcos in Europe that are hiring, because I work with them. I know all the engineers because I work with them. Why don't I play this game? So set up my own recruitment company. Young, I had a business partner in it who had a little bit more experience than I did. I think he was 31, so ancient. We had a year or so, year and a half of it being fantastic. Had an apartment in Amsterdam, one in Dublin, one in London, and it was great. And I thought I was very, very clever. And then, then the
profitable business, making good money, plenty of phone calls, plenty of demand.
Yeah, it was great. And then the bubble burst, and it turned out I wasn't nearly as clever as I thought I was, and hadn't made any provision. I mean, I genuinely thought that the internet was going to keep on expanding forever, and directionally I was right, but
in the long term you were right.
Yeah.
So was it about March 2000 or thereabouts when?
Yeah.
Okay, that's when the bubble burst in my world, and I think some other parts of the world as well.
Exactly, and basically what telcos had, it was it was an interesting learning experience because I knew some of the CEOs of these telcos around Europe, and we'd been having the conversation privately that what they were doing was nuts. Like they were borrowing huge amounts of money to put masses of capacity into the ground. Um, and they kind of knew that it wasn't like long term, it was a good idea, but it wasn't sustainable to be borrowing that much money that quickly. And yet, as one CEO put it to me, if I do the sensible thing, my board will fire me. Because the pressure on the boards and the CEOs was to just get caught up in this hype and build for what was coming. So it wasn't just me, but it didn't make it any less painful when it happened.
Could you, well, it sounds as though you could see some of it coming, referring to those conversations that you had. Um, or is that being too generous with
No,
hindsight?
no, that's generous with hindsight. Like I thought we had years to come. And look, I mean, I was 22, 23. Like I didn't really, you don't think that far ahead. I didn't certainly. But yeah, I mean, like I remember we did the first voice over IP call, and it was super exciting, and we'd get these tiny little grainy horrible videos, and so it was clear that there was going to be this ongoing demand. But yeah, timing is everything, and uh, I could have done with another 5 years.
Netflix was going to get there eventually, but it wasn't it wasn't ready during those days. What do you think some of the key lessons were, even in your early 20-year-old brain?
So I think we kind of got a lot of stuff right, and one of the things I got right was surrounding myself with good people and smart people. Uh, and I think kind of the lesson, if it is a lesson, is that you can get everything right and the timing's wrong, and it's not going to work. Um, and there are countless examples of products that have been launched a year too early and disappeared, especially in the tech space. So yeah, I think there was that. I think we did a lot of good things, right? What's interesting now, looking back at it, was we built our own CRM system because there wasn't a good one on the market, and I think we spent something like 200,000 guilders at the time, which was it was a lot. It was maybe like 150,000 US to build a CRM system so that we could track our recruitments. Um, Today, you can get for free a CRM system that is 100 times better than what
or
we
or
built.
pay a little bit for Salesforce.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just the cost, the barrier to entry to starting a business now is so much lower than it was back in the 90s. So yeah.
Well, if we go back to that same time, we probably had a server room that we had built sitting here in the middle of the United States that we had spent probably $2 to $3 million on the infrastructure and the servers and the switches and all of that sort of thing. And today, Amazon Web Services or Azure, pick your cloud, but there was no cloud service of that sort back then.
No, and the thought of having something so important in somebody else's hands was just, you're incredulous at the idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, let's zoom forward a bit, or quite a bit. You built the fastest growing new public listing in Europe in 2016. Tell us that story.
So yeah, there's kind of there's a few other sort of ventures along the way, but um, I had been in touch with a quite a successful entrepreneur called Jeremy Harbour for some time through a mutual friend, and he had figured out much earlier than I did, the value of M&A when mergers and acquisitions, when growing a company. And so he had sort of started one company, accidentally fell into buying another company, and grew his revenue by a year in one afternoon, and thought, hang on, why have I been focusing on sales and marketing when I could just do this?
By somebody else's revenue.
Exactly. And so he went on a bit of a splurge and an empire hunt, and they were mostly distressed deals. So he was kind of no money down deals, but acquiring these companies and figuring out what he had. And so we'd sort of been in touch for a while, and he phoned me up, and he had this idea. He'd just sold a group of companies to a public company, and um, one of the things he noticed was it's easier for public companies to use their stock than use their cash. The CFO would much prefer to give you stock than cash. So you can actually get a slightly better price if you're willing to take stock in the public company. But it sparked an idea in him, which was what all of us entrepreneurs hate about the idea about being acquired or private equity coming in or something like that, is losing control. Because as entrepreneurs, yeah, this is our heart and soul. This is, yeah, our team, our family, our culture, and we don't want to lose control. But there's obviously huge advantages of being part of something bigger. And so what we created was this idea, which we call agglomeration, which is basically you find owner-operated companies where the founder's not looking to exit, they're looking to grow. And these are not startups, these are well-established, old economy, profitable, cash-generating businesses. And you put them in a group, but you keep each entity independent. So the founder continues to run their business the way they've always run it. But you put them under this holdco, and you keep acquiring companies using your stock. Every owner is on this perpetual earn-in model. So the more profit they contribute to the holdco, the more stock in that holdco they earn. So it's a very equitable solution. You're part of something bigger, but you can't tell another company how they should run their business. They can't tell you how you should run your business, but you've all got a vested interest in each other's success. So passing clients on and contacts is very natural. So that was kind of the idea. I realized that would have solved a lot of problems for me as a small business owner if I'd had that option. And it kind of takes away the binary, do I sell my business or do I keep it? It's kind of a midway ground where you still keep control, but you now have the advantages of public stock and things. So we went out and evangelized that concept and found it had massive traction with entrepreneurs. They loved that idea. And so we put together 4 companies, but we probably had several hundred that said, we love this idea. Once you've gone public, we're all in, but we don't believe you're going to make this work.
So they wanted to see you do it.
Yeah, which is what's more surprising is that we found 4 that would agree to it when we had no idea what we were doing. Anyway, so yeah, we went public, and we started with 4 companies, and we kind of got lucky. We got a bit of lightning in a bottle, and we had quite a few shareholders got hold of the story, liked what we were doing, and then we were just able to roll in these other companies very, very quickly. So we went from 4 companies to 19 companies in about 3 or 4 months. And the share price went ballistic. The share price went from €1 to €9. But we had this challenge, was that we were building this amazing, fast-growing entity. We didn't have any cash. These are all, yeah, they were small companies that they had EBIT, but it wasn't cash. And because they were in a PLC, they were now winning bigger contracts, and they needed cash to expand. And some of the companies needed to buy out early investors before they could come in. And so we we had this amazing roller coaster ride, and then we did a deal with a US company that would basically loan us some money against the value of our stock, and we could keep going. Unfortunately, the guy that ran that took that moment to decide to go off the rails. So we'd done due diligence on him. It never, as far as we know, he'd never done anything illegal before. But that summer, he went AWOL with 3 companies. So he did us, an Australian company, and a Hong Kong company.
Oh
Um,
my.
Took the shares, dumped the shares on the market, and never gave the money. And we think he made off with about $72 million. And it just destroyed us. So 3 million shares got dumped on the market of a microcap company. Everyone had thought we were doing the dumping. And so that was a really, really brutal welcome to the public markets. And it was, yeah, I think I probably didn't sleep for about 3 months. It was just, you've got investors sending death threats. You've got these companies that had sort of placed all their faith in here, and actually, in retrospect, it wasn't the end of the world. The share price dropped from €9 to €2. If we had just said, all right, let's keep doing what we're doing. €1 to €2 in the space of 6 months is still a great result. Let's just carry on doing what we're doing. We would have got through it. Unfortunately, we sort of got a lot of advice that, okay, the reason why this has gone down is investors no longer trust you. You need to bring some old gray hairs onto the board, people that they trust. And actually, that was our biggest mistake, is that we took that advice. We came off the board. We put some seasoned professionals in who promptly gave themselves pay rises, tried to rebrand everyone, and it was just a disaster and ended up getting delisted. So, yeah, that was a bigger, more painful experience from there.
Well, it's a fascinating model. I read your book. It's called Agglomerate, that you wrote with Jeremy Harbour, who you mentioned earlier. Yeah, it's just a different model from most IPOs, most public listings. Were the companies that you put into the portfolio, was there a theme, a vertical, a relationship, or how did you think about that? Kind of on the front end, at least.
Yeah, so we've done multiple ones since. So that one was just a group of marketing companies, which was kind of the easiest to start with, because I think, yeah, it was a new, unproven model, but grouping together marketing companies was well understood. And actually, many of the companies that we had built agencies before. They'd sold them to a WPP or a Publicis or Omnicom, been fired from their own company because they're now reporting to an accountant. And so they loved the idea of the independence that they would get with us, and that's why they came to us. In We now sort of have a combination. So we also did another group that was much more like a traditional conglomerate, insofar as all the same principles applied, but we went across multiple industries, and multiple industries gives you some redundancy in economic times. It also allows you to grow faster because there's always deals. And basically we would group companies into industry verticals, but if they fell outside of that industry vertical, we could just create a new industry vertical. And pros and cons with both approach. I think there's a finite number of investors that understand and like the conglomerate approach, whereas industry specific, it's an easier sell to investors. Yeah, it was kind of we've been doing it now for 9 years, and the core premise is the same, but we've sort of evolved a lot, and it's a pretty tight ship now.
Like where does it work well and where maybe doesn't it? Whether that's geographic, industry type, sort of story that can be told, whether it's conglomerate story or vertical story or whatever the case may be.
So geographically, I don't think there's much challenge, although I do. We've always we've been very international in nature just because we bounce around the world and that's kind of how we think. But a lot of small companies are very national focused. And so um, the longer term, the sort of the aim is you have a few of these in each country. I mean, I personally, I think there's huge value in having international experience and international sister companies, but I understand that. I we focus on English language, English rule of law, but uh, there's a lot of we get a lot of requests from India to, and because of Indian foreign ownership laws, we can't bring them into an international group, so we'd have to do a group there. But I think the model works anywhere. We've had a lot of people that have tried to replicate it with startups. Now we very deliberately focused on older economy, well-established companies. Sort of most of the businesses that we acquired were 10 to 20 years old or older. We've had people that have tried to replicate the idea with startups, but with startups, the founders aren't that tied in to the business. Like if times are tough after a couple of years, you can walk away from it. If you've built a construction company up over 20 years and times are tough, you dig in. And so I think startups don't really work. We've always avoided the tech space, and partly it's because the tech space is so well covered. There's so many people with eyes on that, and really our focus was to say half of the world's economy sits between startups and 200 million, like the big guys. Half of the world's economy, 90% of private sector employment is that small business, old economy companies, and they're completely overlooked. Like it's from a pure investment perspective, half the world's economy is an asset class that nobody's touching. They're too small, they're too illiquid, and so they can't get growth capital. It's a very weird space, and it's a bit of an unloved space. It's too small for private equity, although they are starting to come lower and lower. So for us, it was kind of greenfield territory. We could go in there, and most of these companies don't have a lot of other options, and that always makes giving them a new option a plus place to be.
So, yeah, you talk about companies with some more age, experience of the owners. Is there a sweet spot for, EBITDA and or revenue or some combination of the two as well?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, we tend to focus on EBIT rather than EBITDA because, as you know, you can hide whatever you like in the DAR. It's the made up stuff. So we would focus on EBIT, on net cash. Yeah, really, I think between 1 and 5 to 10 million EBIT is the sweet spot. Below that, uh, above that, you typically have a decent CFO that can do the numbers. Below that, you tend to have a bookkeeper. That the transition from a small private company to a public company, it's a bit of a jump. Above 10 million EBIT, you're really starting to knock on the doors of private equity. So even like I always like to say that our entrepreneurs are too smart to go with private equity, but you definitely have more options, and it's kind of I suppose that 1 to 5 million. You just don't have it's a good business, but you just don't have a lot of options.
Yeah, and if an owner is maybe contemplating retirement at some point or whatever, it's like, well, it's throwing off good dividends. But if I let go of the business, I would like to sell it for something, but it's going to be really hard for a younger entrepreneur to have the cash to do it. unless I really take a chance on them. That's some sort of a buyout schedule or something.
Exactly right. And I think, you've got a whole generation. So 70% of all small businesses are owned by baby boomers. A lot of these businesses, despite what they tell you, are very dependent on the founder. And buyers know that. And so the multiples are pretty unattractive. So exactly what you said, like if the company's spitting off $1 million, $1.5 million a year, and somebody offers you 2 million or 3 million for the company, well, you might as well just hang on to it for another couple of years. Yeah. So there's not. I mean, again, that's sort of why we played in that space. It's an underserved spot. But there's, you put together 20 or 30 companies that are all spitting off $1 million plus in net cash, and it starts to look like a real company.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can think of the countless number of private equity pitches, and yeah, it's like 10 million in EBIT or above. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I think the other thing, I mean, I've got some friends in private equity, but it doesn't stop me berating the industry. I think they, their model is to flip businesses. They need to get them off their books rapidly. And the interesting thing about somebody that's built their company up over 20 or 30 years is selling it. Money is one part, and it's an important part, but it's not the only part. The idea of private equity coming in, gutting your team, saddling with the company with as much debt as it can bear, cutting back customer service to the clients that you've been with for 30 years. Like all of that is, it's your legacy. And it's not for a lot of entrepreneurs, that's too high a price to pay. Whatever the initial sum that private equity offers you, which, by the way, is never what you end up with. Just giving up what you've built to that is not that attractive.
so I spend a lot of time in the startup world, and I understand what you're saying for why you focus on where you're focusing on, but I can't help but try, in my mind at least, to apply some of the principles that you're talking about, because again, it's a contrarian approach. So if nothing else, I'm attracted to that. But think about, certainly beyond the startup phase, but the company that is in the 5 to 8 to 10 years has developed a good business, and the founder is fine to keep going, but it's time. Investors would like some liquid events, potentially employees would. There's a whole bunch of things, and I can't help, because of the way that we've done investing here, at least in some, it might be wide verticals, but it's still verticals. Think about putting some of those companies together and let them still run, but we can tell a bit of a story in, for example, animal health tech or something like that, which is big in this part of the United States and a big part of our portfolio of investing.
Yeah. So look, there definitely is opportunity to do M&A and consolidation in the early stage space. I think there's a whole bunch of different challenges that come with it, and they're not insurmountable. You just need to be aware of them. I think one of the things that I became very interested in when you're buying companies that are 50, 60 years old, as we have done, you start to think about your responsibility to keeping that company going for another 50 or 60 years. And so I started looking at, excuse me, I started looking at companies that survive hundreds of years or over 1,000 years, and there's not a huge amount of them, and they typically tend to fall into religious iconography or alcohol, which draw whatever conclusions you like from that. and the
Some
kind of
things persist over centuries.
exactly human nature. And what was interesting was the defining. I was trying to find out like what's the defining factor between them, and it's basically not doing anything stupid. It's not like across all the things, none of them had done anything particularly clever, but none of them had done anything stupid. And the ones like the oldest company in existence was a Japanese property company that had building temples, and then in the 80s, the management of this 1,500-year-old company decided to take out massive loans and speculate on property in Tokyo, and destroyed that business. So they broke the rule of not doing something stupid. Now, what's interesting and why I'm sharing this is that when you build a company for longevity, you ask very different questions and you look at the game very, very differently. And nobody does that. Nobody is doing that. Um, and it's I mean I don't want to blame Silicon Valley, but it's definitely the sort of the language out of Silicon Valley, language around startups, and language around Wall Street. It's all very short term. It's all growth. And yeah, these surveys pop up all the time, but something like the last one I saw was in London, 97% of public list code directors freely admit to sacrificing long-term value for short-term gain. Freely admit it. They're like, yeah, that's my job. I have to hit quarterly numbers. Like what comes down the line, that's somebody else's problem. And the problem is there is no real incentive for building a company that's still here in 100 years, unless you're kind of born, you're tied to legacy. And so what happens with startups, going back to your point, is that there is this push to grow. The venture capital model, which you're very familiar with, puts a lot of pressure on founders to hit it out of the park on every single deal, because VCs is the 1 in 10 model. They need each of their need one of these companies to be the $1 billion unicorn, and so there's a lot of pressure on founders to swing for the fences every single time, which means that you end up a little bit like the CEOs and the telcos making decisions that are wrong, but because you've got this pressure on you to do it. And then kind of added into that, as you mentioned, you've got investors that want to exit. And so if you're putting deals together and you've got investors that want to exit, you're constantly trying to backfill leaving investors. And having done this for a number of years, that's a very tough place to be, and it kind of ends up taking away all of your focus from growth into just backfilling in investors. And we can get onto it later, but if we ended up having to change our model to solve that problem, because I think that's the biggest problem that the public markets have right now, is that when people go public, and if you Google IPOs, everything is about how to exit via an IPO. All the investment banks this is how you can get your exit. Angel investors want to exit, early investors, founders want to get cash off the table, staff want to get cash off the table. So unless you can drive an insane amount of hype to absorb all that sell pressure, the share price is never going to go up. It's just going to go down. And so it's you just need to kind of be aware of these little sort of side things that can derail you quite quickly.
Yeah, you give me a unpleasant flashback to an exit event, and it's 1 or 2 years afterwards, and I went to one of the investors in my company, and I was complaining a bit about how badly the acquiring company had screwed everything up, in my opinion at least. And he looks at me and he's like, Kevin, like, they paid. Like 85% of these things don't work. Like, what's your problem? Well, when you put products into the world that customers are happy with and provide value, and then those get like either taken out or taken off or messed up. I mean, it's like acting like an owner.
And I think one of the things that I learned the hard way is that founders create that founders and investors create value in different ways. And the assumption that founders have is that investors have the same mindset as them. And it's very, very different. So founders will often sacrifice profit to create value. So we do it all the time. We win a big contract, we use that money to hire staff so we can go and do more. Investors make profit to create value, and so for their LPs, they need to make that profit. And so investors end up thinking entrepreneurs are idiots, and entrepreneurs end up thinking investors are evil, blood-sucking monsters. And the public markets is when you kind of have this clash. So it's it's a clash of values, and I think you kind of almost have to become an investor yourself to start to understand the mindset and view it through the lenses of an investor. Otherwise, you're always going to be fighting this force you just don't understand, because it's so far removed from what we do as entrepreneurs.
And certainly that's a little bit of what we're trying here. I say that we have to build capacity to deploy risk capital, and that's training ourselves as investors, but at the same time, training entrepreneurs and founders for that push and pull that naturally occurs between investors and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Like, so I run a program called the Veblen Directors Programme, which helps women, minorities, and first timers to get their first board seats. And one of the exercises that we do very early on is go and buy $100 worth of stock in a microcap. And it's not because I think they're going to make money on microcaps. It's because you realize how bad most microcaps are at communicating with investors in terms of what an investor's interested in. So they might do a great product demo because that's what they're used to doing, but that's not what an investor needs to see to make a decision. And I also sort of strongly recommend kind of doing a little bit of angel investing. Not because I think you make any money from angel investing, but I think you learn a lot of lessons about thinking about things in a different way. And I think it is important. And I think we very much take the idea that as soon as you start looking for money, your stock is the product. And so you need to understand the client, and you need to understand the problems that the client faces. And I think for most entrepreneurs, it's like we have this word investors, which is so confusing. Like somebody that sticks $5,000 into a company is an investor. Somebody that runs a $7 trillion hedge fund is an investor. They are not the same.
Two different things.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yet you kind of get into this whole and I think I set up another company to help people learn to raise capital, because I believe the way that I believe the whole capital raising approach is predicated on something that worked 50 years ago, and hasn't really changed much since then. And I just don't think it's relevant. So to expand on that, you remember sort of in the 90s when a company went public, it was big news because finally we got mum and pop investors and other investors got a chance to get access to this deal. And it was exciting. It was an opportunity. And there used to be politicians would talk about more companies need to go public so that investors can get access to them. Today, investors are just swamped with opportunity. There are no end of opportunities out. I mean, the biggest companies in the world are still growing at 25% a year and sitting on 100 billion in cash. Everyone else is competing with that. You've got real estate, you've got REITs, you've got every man, woman, and child is raising capital for a startup. So investors are not short of choice. So the idea that if you just come up with a great pitch deck, and it gets in front of the investor, "Oh, now I was just here with my checkbook waiting for a great idea." It doesn't work like that. What we want is access to deals through trusted parties. Like we want somebody that we know, like, and trust to say, "Hey, I stuck some money into this. You should take a look at it." That's what we're after. That's that kind of trusted approach. And so this idea of kind of build a pitch deck and go knocking on doors, it's just, I mean, it's soul destroying to go through. And look, it's same in public markets. In the public markets, the conventional wisdom is go to these investor conferences, stand up on stage, talk through your numbers, and hope that you inspire somebody to invest in your stock. Um, but especially in micro caps and small caps, it's not like that. It's all done through relationships. And so building those relationships based on what investors want, not what you want, but what investors want is in my mind is the only way to bridge that gap. Otherwise it's excruciatingly painful.
So I love that idea of building trust and investors wanting to access deals through trusted parties. You spoke earlier about long-termism versus short-termism. As I think about trust, is there a shortcut to trust? I don't, it's like, well, anyway, there's this old investment thing like, well, my friend Callum invested in it. I don't know anything about it, but he's a smart guy, so I'll invest. And that may not be a bad hack, although it's sometimes famous last words in terms of saying goodbye to your investment.
Look, I mean, absolutely there is, which is you align yourself with something that people already trust. There's a reason why brands use celebrities to endorse their thing. So anything that you can do to, if you don't know the investor that you're trying to get into, you want to be introduced to them by someone they know, like, and trust, and anything else that you can do. So I wrote an article many years ago for a tech site, which was don't go looking for funds, look for trust. And what I was advocating at the time was whatever stage business you're at, build a board of advisors before you do anything else. Get 4 or 5 people. You don't need to pay them. Most, especially company employees, are so happy to live vicariously through your entrepreneurial journey. Like meeting them for a coffee once a month, even virtually, is a great opportunity. And every single week, just send them an email saying, these are the actions I took this week. These are the results I got this week. Don't ask them for anything. Definitely don't ask them for money. Just show them what you're doing. At the end of 3 months, get them all together over lunch. Say, hey, look, I think we need to expand. We've made some good progress. I need to raise some capital. I don't know anything about raising capital. Does anyone here know anything or know anyone that might be interested? And half the time, half of them will pull out their checkbooks because they've spent 3 months seeing you deliver on everything that you said you would do, or at least being transparent and open with them. And the other half will say, well, look, it's not for me, but I can definitely introduce you to such and such. And no, entrepreneurs don't want to hear that because they want the investment today. But you need to build these relationships, and it's a much better way of.
There's a great adage, right? If you ask for money, you're going to get advice. If you ask for advice, you may get money.
Like it's very true, and yeah, you use it to your advantage.
Well, Callum, you've talked a little bit about some ups and downs for you and those you've been involved with. How do you think about failures in the whole business development or just in business? How do you process yourself from like a personal perspective failures? You talked about in this really dramatic thing where somebody stole money essentially from you and your investors that you didn't sleep for 3 months. And I don't doubt there's very little exaggeration in that, having lived through some similar things. How do you think about that? Having a little bit of perspective, having been through it a few times.
Um, I think I was actually I had a bit of a back and forth with Cody Sanchez, who you might be familiar with, on this. And one of the things I was saying is that what happens is your tolerance for pain goes up. So the the things that were what I thought were life ending when I was 25 are now just another Thursday. Um, and, and so definitely you kind of get more perspective. Again, my business partner, Jeremy, has a great analogy for this, which he says being an entrepreneur is like walking a tightrope. And if the business fails, you fall off the tightrope. But what you don't learn until you do that is that the tightrope is only a foot off the floor. It's not the end of the world. Like you bump your knee and then you kind of get up and get on with it again. Um, and so, look, I don't want to fail. No, nobody wants to fail, but it is an inevitable part of the journey. One of the mantras that we have at the Veblen Director Programme, which I stole from the All Blacks rugby team in New Zealand, is get comfortable being uncomfortable. Like constantly be putting yourself into these uncomfortable situations when you don't need to, because that's where the learning comes. And then when you do get put into them, not only are you comfortable being in those uncomfortable positions, you might even start to thrive in those uncomfortable positions. And something kicks in and you go, right, yeah, this is where I can get my best results. So look, I certainly don't look for failure, although it might sound like it. But yeah, it's an integral part. And I actually had an interesting conversation on LinkedIn recently, saying oftentimes it's not even so much failure that is the fear; it's almost the embarrassment of what people around us will think if we fail. And that's an incredibly strong feeling, but it's also that's a really bad way to live your life, not doing something just because you're going to be embarrassed by your peers. Um, so I think the context for that was that I was saying sometimes it's easier when you're in a different country. You kind of get away from your peers and nobody knows you, so it's easier to sort of make those mistakes. But yeah, I think it's part of the journey, and it also makes for the most interesting stories, sadly.
It does. I mean, I think we've lost kind of the concept of how to handle risk, and that risk is part of the process, and that there is risk, and but it's sort of like safety as a priority above everything else doesn't work.
A risky strategy.
It's a very risky strategy, and anyway, I'm not going to remember the quote very well, but another U.S. presidential candidate who was shot during a campaign, Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, and then gave a speech while he was bleeding from his chest, but obviously lived through the whole thing anyway. He's got this wonderful little speech he gave called "In the Arena," and essentially it's just saying, to the person who's in the arena with the blood and the dirt and the sweat and the mistakes goes all the credit. We don't make progress without people who try. And I fear too much of our messaging to young people in particular is where's security? And I go bonkers when a young person is evaluating career opportunities and they're 22 years old and they talk to me about retirement plans. It's like, oh my goodness.
I mean, one thing that sort of gives me a bit of hope around that is that pr- the barrier to entry to starting something new is so low now that you can you can have a job and have a side hustle that is, and that, honestly, that's a great way to learn and figure out the sales stuff. And um you don't need to be as idiotic as we were 30, 40 years ago, where you kind of really bet everything on this working. So it's much easier now to make smaller, less painful mistakes, and still learn from them. But yeah, I agree. You need to be you got to be out there and in the arena.
Yeah, there's a right time to use it. Anyway, assuming that you're transitioning from working for somebody else to starting your own thing, there's a right time to use those two most powerful words, I resign. But I do agree, there's, I think, much more optionality in today's world to at least experiment with the side hustle and be able to do it in a time efficient manner and learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think I almost think it's crazy not to, like, that the if you can, in a few hours in the evening and the weekends, put together a landing page. I mean, there's so many tools out there. But start talking to prospective clients either online or not. And I think also there's so many ways you can take capital. If I launch a business now, I've done this for many years now. It took me a very long time to learn, but I used to go out and talk to the market, which would normally be my friends in the pub, and say, "Do you think this is a good idea?" And they say, "Yes, that's a great idea." And I say, "Would you buy it?" And they say, "Yeah, I'd buy it." So I'd go and build it, and then 6 months later, I'd go back to them and go, "Got it? Do you want to buy it?" And they go, "Ah, it's not a good time." Um, and so now everything I do, I need to get advance orders before I build it. And the ability to do that on the internet now is great. Throw up a landing page, get people to join a waiting list, get them to put down a deposit that's refundable if you don't build the thing. But if you can't get capital off people up front, then building the thing and then going and then it becomes, now you're so attached to the product and you're needy because you need the capital to pay back what you've invested in it. That's the worst way to approach it. So yeah, it's a in many ways it's a much easier environment, I think, to get started now,
Yeah.
although nobody wants to hear
Yeah.
that.
Well, let's wind towards the end of our conversation. This framework that I use for trying to describe to people how to make entrepreneurial decisions and have an entrepreneurial mindset is it ultimately about decision making. If you reflect back on the many decisions that you've made over the course of your career, what is one that you think is particularly interesting and illuminating for our audience?
Yeah, I think they all kind of, something triggers something else, which triggers something else. I think the probably making the decision to work with Jeremy and explore the capital markets. And I think what came from that was a knowledge, a very painful learning experience. And I think kind of a lot of the advice that we got at the time and over the next few years was, look, you're playing a game with people that have been in this industry for 20, 30 years. Like, Wall Street's brutal. You'll get eaten up and spat out. And a lot of entrepreneurs go public and then come back off the markets and swear they'd never do that again. And I think we were bloody minded enough or stupid enough to keep going back and keep trying to figure it out. And actually, what you realize is that when you look at the markets through a different lens, you can see how flawed a lot of it is. And actually, because you're coming at it from a different angle, then you see lots of opportunities. And uh, Yeah, I think sort of, probably the decision to not give up after that first listing problem was, and part of that was driven by the fact we knew that if we didn't do this, nobody else was likely to do it, and it was potentially a great solution for small businesses.
So take the hard learnings and figure out how to improve it.
Yeah, because otherwise the learnings aren't valuable. Like if we just walked away from that, I don't think we would have got to use those learnings. And so, um, but yeah, it wasn't an easy decision by any stretch.
Well, I find it a highly interesting model. Well, Callum, thank you for spending time with us. How can our audience follow you, get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's the best place. And if you want to connect, mention this podcast so that I know who you are. And then if you go to callumlaing.com and stick your email address in, all of my books are available for my subscribers. So Bezos has enough money. I don't think he needs any more sales. If any of those topics are of interest, feel free to go and get those books.
All right. Thank you, Callum.